As Aaron mentioned, on Tuesday, the recommendations are very much draft, and the purpose of these final working groups is to get feedback on these recommendations. So we hope that today will be a discussion, and we'll have lots of opportunity for people to weigh in. A few logistics. I would say the most important thing from this list is to just state your name before you speak, or if you're writing in the chat box, I will try to announce who you are so that we can put it in the meeting minutes and for the record. But if you want to add your title or any information like that to your comments in the chat, please feel free to. It's been working pretty well in the past, but if I read your chat out loud, it's for the public record, that's why. And the recording will be shared on the Hydrogen Task Force webpage through the Green Bank. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, at the very top of the meeting, after we introduce ourselves and see who's on the line, I will spend some time discussing, the format of the report and what that will look like in the next steps. We'll spend the lion's share of the time on findings and recommendations, but really more towards the the recommendation side, since we've talked about findings, I would say, in a lot of our previous working groups. We'll have plenty of time for discussion. I anticipate with the size of the group we have and the content we have to cover, we may not need the full hour and a half. And then we will adjourn. So first of all, I'd love to see who's on the line. I think we have some familiar and some new faces. I'm going to go down the participants list. If folks wouldn't mind unmuting when I get to you and just quickly introducing yourself, we'd love to know who's in the room and also take it down for the meeting minutes. So top of my list, I have Alex Judd.
Hey, good morning, all. Yeah, this is Alex, partner at Dave Pitney. We're here to support the Green Bank and Stratogen with any kind of research projects or anything like that. So been part of these discussions. Just so happy to hear all the progress we've made and looking forward to discuss today. So thanks, Lily.
Thanks, Alex. Andrea, you're up next.
Hi, this is Andrea Labawi with Regulatory Affairs for Sustainable Transportation in the Washington, D.C. office of Toyota.
Well, thank you so much for joining. Brian Farnan.
Hi, Brian Farnan, General Counsel and Chief Legal Officer for the Connecticut Green Bank, and been part of this process from the beginning, and excited to see the progress we made.
Great, thank you for joining. Oh, Brian Garcia, just in time. Is it too early to introduce yourself? I just saw your name pop up.
Was that me?
Yeah.
Brian Garcia, President and CEO of the Connecticut Green Bank. Good to see everyone.
Thanks for joining. Sorry, I was going down my list and you were right there, the right time. Binu.
Good morning, everyone. Binu Chandy from DECD. I had the Office of Brownfields for DECD. I've been involved in a minimum capacity in this effort, but I'm seated for Carmen and Alexandra Dom today.
Thank you. And I would say you've definitely participated in more than a minimum capacity. You provided an awesome presentation and have been reviewing our recommendations. So thank you for your engagement. Erin.
Good morning, everyone. Erin Childs, Director of Strategy and Consulting.
Barbara Fernandez.
Good morning, everyone, and a happy holiday. I'm not sure we're going to get together before the holidays, but I wish everyone a happy and healthy holidays with your family. Barbara Fernandez from the University of Connecticut, and started this journey with you guys a while ago, and it's an amazing amount of work that this group has done, and I'm very proud of the accomplishments.
So much. Kaya, you're up next.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Good morning. And I'm Kaya. I'm an analyst at Strategen.
And Kai, you're taking the meeting minutes, right? So if there's
Yes.
okay, good to know. Thank you. Since there's anything for public record you'd like stated, Kaya will be taking that down. Let's see, Lydia, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. So yeah, Lydia Rupert from the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And yes, Barbara, happy holidays, everyone.
Thanks, Lydia. Thanks for joining. And Samantha.
Hi, Lily. Hi, everyone. Sam Danowski, she, her. I am the state director of Sierra Club's Connecticut chapter. And good to see everybody.
Thank you so much. All right. So we will dive in. Thank you all for your introductions. Just making sure no one joined in the meantime. Okay. So the first thing I just want to cover is kind of where we're going from here. This is the last working group. So all of the other activities will be kind of coordinated with other working groups and also in the final task force meeting, which is in January. The structure, so the final deliverable of this effort is a report. The structure that I just wanted to share that our recommendations are currently following. So each mandated item or area of study from the Special Act has a section where we're going to detail the findings, which is a summary of the research, our recommendations, which we'll be talking about today, but those are really specific actionable next steps based on our findings. And then we have a section that specifically details stakeholder feedback. So this has written all of our captured feedback from working groups. So what you all have shared, task force meetings, and also we had a request for written comments. So we were thankful to get a lot of great feedback from that and are integrating that into our stakeholder feedback portion. So all of that being said, we really do welcome all feedback. For anything that can't be directly integrated into our recommendations or changed, we will certainly capture that in the stakeholder feedback. So we are currently sort of making that section more robust through all the written comments, which were due, I think, on Friday. So we're still working our way through everything. But I've shown some of the comments in this presentation so you can get a sense of some of the feedback you'll see showing up. And then just as a reminder, the sections that this funding or this working group, the funding working group, is contributing towards. We looked at an examination of how to position the state to take advantage of competitive incentives and programs from the IIJA. So we'll be sharing findings, recommendations, stakeholder feedback related to that area. Recommendations related to building hydrogen fueled energy facilities at brownfield sites, and also recommendations for other funding sources for developing hydrogen fueled energy programs and infrastructure. So this working group is contributing towards 3 major sections of the final report. And so as Aaron and I were chatting about at the beginning of this call, we have a pretty structured timeline to get to the finish line. So this is actually the first of the final round of working groups. So at the end of this presentation, I'll show sort of the other recommendations that we're not talking about in this call. So obviously we represent just one portion out of, I believe there's 8 different sections. And so to discuss any of the other recommendations that aren't covered, I know, Brian, to discuss any of the other recommendations that weren't covered in this working group, I recommend tuning into the others. There's a policy and workforce development one, infrastructure, sources and uses, later on in the week and early next week. I will share that there is a lot of overlap between funding and policy. We've made sure to kind of true up our recommendations and make sure they're really consistent. So I would say the ones that we address probably the least in this working group is we don't have a ton of overlap with the sources and infrastructure recommendations. So as Erin and I mentioned, the task force will be provided the report on Friday, and we do apologize for the quick holiday turnaround. Hopefully you can read it while in a comfy sweater or being really cozy and enjoying the pre-holiday. But we would ask for feedback by the 23rd. The final text will be distributed in the beginning of January, and then that final task force meeting will serve to vote out the final report. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to lift up that this is a truly terrible time to have this crunched time period, probably for the consultants as well, to try and get this all done by the 6th. I understand the legislature is looking for it by the 15th, but I think there may be some requests to extend that feedback period. And so I just want to say, I think it would be helpful to be thinking about that in order not to, put more stress on folks during this end of the year time period.
I understand. I think we've been trying to do a lot of early slices, and we provided an early draft of the report and have been talking about the recommendations in a few different forums, but I definitely hear that, and we'll chat with the with the Green Bank team about what may be possible and make sure that feedback is heard. And thank you. I saw the second in the comments. Thanks, everybody. Any other thoughts? Oh, go ahead.
Just one follow-up question, because Samantha, you're right. Like this timing isn't great. I'll tell you that we're working diligently, but also feeling sort of the holiday crunch on our side. I would love if there's, so we're, as we understand it, the January 15 deadline is quite firm. And so if there's any thoughts that folks have on ways that we can make the review process more accessible during that limited window, we also welcome feedback there, because we are trying our hardest to give folks a chance to weigh in and make sure that all perspectives are really well reflected, especially in that stakeholder feedback section. And so, yeah, we're in this time crunch together, and so we certainly welcome any suggestions that folks have on that. Sorry, Lily, back to you.
Yeah, I just thank you for that. I know we all want to provide you good feedback, but starting to panic a little bit about the time window.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that feedback. It's certainly important to capture, and we will discuss it today. Thank you. All righty. There's no other comments. Keep it moving forward. So, as I mentioned, I won't be going too into detail on findings. I think we've been sort of discussing those for a few working groups. So we'll focus on the recommendations, which hopefully will give a really good sense of what will be in the report and make it a little easier to review. The first area that we'll be providing recommendations on in the report, or that I'd like to discuss, it's not necessarily chronologically in the report first, but we didn't get to discuss the brownfield recommendations last time, so I wanted to start with that. The Special Act 22-8 specifically talks about the targeted brownfield loan program, but in our report, we're going to talk about the toolbox that can be applied for remediation and restoration of brownfields for hydrogen development. We are focusing in specifically, I would say, mostly on the grant and loans, which provide pretty substantial opportunities. The grant program recipients can get up to 2 million historically, and for the loan program, potentially up to 4 for remediation and repurposing of brownfields. So some of the key findings that we'll be discussing in the report is that these programs are designated for highest and best end use, so they wouldn't necessarily be adapted or need to be adapted to ensure that funding is applicable to support remediation or repurposing of brownfields for hydrogen. But proposals are scored competitively based on a rubric, and that has historically been defined in each funding cycle. And in recent funding cycles, renewable energy projects are given an additional scoring credit. So there is a recognition of renewable energy projects being a priority. So we go into in the report, we go a bit deeper into the eligible uses of funding. We won't chat too much about that today. You can certainly reference some of our previous working groups for more detail on that. But diving into our recommendations. And
Hi, I'm sorry, this is Andrea from Toyota. Can I just intervene for a second? Can you summarize what part of this is this the grant programs that already exist, or is this your recommendations for how to change them? I'm not quite clear on what is current and what is new.
Yes, this is current. So these are the more on the findings side. And then the recommendations will be specifically marked as that, but thank you for clarifying. I'll make that clearer. This is based on the current program.
Oh, understood. Thank you so much, Lily.
Oh yeah, of course. And everyone should chime in at any point. This is meant to be a working group, so we can take our hands in and it can be conversational. So in terms of the recommendations for how these programs can be utilized to advance hydrogen infrastructure and potentially facilities, we recommended first and foremost that DEEP and DECD should continue maintaining the Connecticut Brownfields Inventory as a resource for potential developers to identify prospective project sites. It is important to note that this actually is not comprehensive of all brownfields in the state. It specifically includes those which have received funding for assessment or remediation at the state or federal level, or those that have already been accepted into the liability relief program. So it's really not, the feedback we got is it's not possible to have everything reflected in this inventory, but it could be a great start. So that currently lives on the DEEP website, but could be a great resource for moving forward. We also recommend that DEEP and DECD continue to support the development of clean energy projects on brownfields and specifically projects that have community support and or have completed community benefits agreements. So more specifically, we noted that on the DECD side, this could include continuing to provide scoring based on scoring in each funding cycle that where renewable energy projects get more additional credit. Additionally, those that have community support and community benefits agreements. So, oh yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
Yes, I'm glad the new is on because I have a question. The scoring rubric that we currently use, does it have a community benefit agreements as one of the items in it?
No, it doesn't, Barbara.
Yeah. Well,
but we sort of evaluate whether the community has been community involvement was there, but we don't specifically give points for that, but we make sure that there has been community involvement and community sign off on any project.
I just want to recommend that perhaps this could be a consideration simply because so much of the hydrogen funding through the federal government has a community benefit agreement, as you know very well, and as a requirement. So we may want to consider just possibly, you don't have to give it extra points, maybe just adding it to the rubric.
And just building from that, and then I think I had another comment, but just building from that, in the policy working group, there is the recommendation around Public Act 2143, which has to do with just transition. And for those of you who are following it, any project, class 1 renewable energy project that's greater than 2 megawatts has to have a community benefit agreement, a community environmental benefit agreement, whatever. I believe there's a recommendation coming through that would try to include hydrogen in Public Act 2143. So if you were developing a hydrogen project of some capacity to be determined, the legislature, ENT, if they wanted to move that direction, would have to determine that, would then, to your point, Barbara, require a community benefit agreement as part of that public act. So I believe there's a structure policy-wise that may end up in a recommendation to include CBAs from a hydrogen perspective. Now, what I heard you saying, Barbara, was recommending to Banu programmatically thinking about a conclusion there as well.
Yeah, from a program, that this is why you are so important, Brian, because no one else in the state grooves into this stuff like you do. So,
well, I'm gonna add. Well, thank you. I'm gonna add a point of consideration on the first item here. The importance of that brownfield inventory, Brian. I'm thinking about underneath the IRA, the energy communities adder that has to deal with, all the things we think about in terms of old coal-fired power plants and the like, but it also includes brownfield sites, which I'm not sure has been defined federally by Treasury. So there's a part of me that wants to say something in here, Lily, and like Banu, that's like DEEP and DECDs should continue maintaining the Connecticut brownfield inventory as a resource for potential developers to identify protective project sites, including those that are eligible for energy communities underneath the Inflation Reduction Act. That would just create a distinction where at some future point, certain brownfields in Connecticut may get a 10% adder on a tax credit if they fall into that bucket.
I know that there is an adder for solar projects, at least under the IRA. So
yeah, it's all
in brownfields, bright fields or something. It's a cute name.
Yeah.
I did think they had a definition for brownfields because there are other tax credits at the federal level for brownfields. So it would have to be defined under there. I'm assuming those will get carried over to kind of the ITC, but that's my high level understanding. I'm not an expert.
So whatever that language is, like consistent with existing practice, I think the point is that we're trying to reinforce the federal investment here alongside the state program, which is a potential 10% investment tax credit. So Banu, we could work with you on like whatever that is. I think it's just highlighting, a potential linkage to the federal definition of energy communities.
And we have an issue about the definition of brownfields. Brownfields are not only contaminated sites, they have to have that economic development focus. The sites have to be vacant, abandoned, and only then it becomes a brownfield as per the state definition. So maybe we should use the word potential if you're including all these sites that we think are brownfields. And I believe DEEP is working on a different definition because they're giving, I forget the program, but that's solar incentives. When they're giving extra credits when they come for that funding. So I think they're going to try and use a different definition, a slightly different definition, so that it doesn't interfere with the definition we use when we award our projects. So
Well,
we
so-
have to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, so to your point, it could be comma, including those potentially eligible for energy communities underneath the Inflation Reduction Act. That's probably the end of that sentence that ties it up.
Lydia, I saw you pop on. I'm not sure if you had a thought on the deep
I,
definition.
I was just giving the thumbs up
Oh,
to what was being said. I don't know very much about the solar project regarding that, but I do know that they are working on that. So yeah, it is what was mentioned by the DC.
Yeah, I'm putting something on the screen. Don't get attached to
But
it.
if it helps,
Just
and
get it
I can also gather some more information and get back to you, Lady, after.
okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think it would be great to just recognize that there may be some discrepancy between certain definitions and agree that we should look to tie in the energy communities portion and potentially we can either do that in the description or we can see how we can work it into the main recommendation. Alrighty. Where were we? Okay. I think we were on the third recommendation. And then I just wanted to repeat what I heard from the second one, that DECD should, or let's see, that we really would want to emphasize the community involvement portion. And then maybe as we're talking about the Public Act, about community benefits agreements, consider how in the future this program could be worked in through that. And then finally, we recommended that DECD should evaluate the need for additional funding for this program to help meet the clean energy needs of the state and its subsequent land requirements. We know that IRA and IIJA have both earmarked significant clean energy investment funding within the next decade, and there may be a near-term significant increase in clean energy project proposals. So the legislature may consider allocating additional funding to these programs, as is specified, by the program administrators, just to ensure that these programs can be leveraged without reducing funding for other really critical applications of existing funding. Like I know that the Brownfields programs often fund things like affordable housing. So this is something that we just wanted to call out as a potential for consideration. Of course, pending stakeholder processes and the appropriate forums to determine what the ask would be. Any comments or thoughts on these before we move on?
The third one, all of that is pending DECD's support and then the support of the legislature to provide additional funding. There's a part of me that wants to bring into that the Governor's Council on Climate Change principle, which was something along the lines of prioritization of such funding should be devoted to vulnerable communities, in the context of the federal government, that's low income and disadvantaged communities. So I want to add, like Lydia, into that some sort of Justice 40 element that give priority to the low income disadvantaged communities, revitalization zones, however DECD, maybe it's distressed communities from a DECD perspective, but some way of ensuring funding that's made available goes to those who need it the most.
Benefits of them. And I'm not sure, Benu, if that's already a part of the program, or it sounds like that would be maybe a newer
It is, yeah, it is part of the scoring rubric, distressed municipalities, all that, they get additional points. So they kind of surface up to the top automatically. But Brian, are you saying that perhaps a percentage of our funds should be set aside? We have other new programs that are specially focused to those kinds of disadvantaged communities, the Connecticut Community Investment Fund. I'm not sure if that is what you're talking about, setting aside specifically, some funds for every round for these kinds of communities. And if it doesn't get used, then use that, whatever is left over for other needs.
I think, Banu, your scoring rubric of distressed works. I
Okay.
think that works broadly. But you did mention the CIF, which might, I mean, we might footnote that if there's any just background, not that you have an allocated CIF portion for hydrogen, but I think the notion of the CIF broadly, maybe something to speak to or not. I don't know.
Yeah, I would be cautious about moving into that CIF territory, because those funds in that process is very different from what the new and from our work. Don't forget CIF funds a lot of different projects because it's governed by a different governance. So if we want to include it, that's okay. I'm just saying we need to be careful.
Fair enough. Let's keep with what we've got. I'm good. Thank you all.
Okay. And yeah, just to note that we recognize that further stakeholder engagement would be needed in the appropriate forums to identify exact incentives and funding amounts, but looking to recommend next steps and identify the people that would be responsible for potentially carrying that forward. And just to note, I know this sounds like strong language, like deep in DECD should. I will share that we've discussed with all of these folks, and anything that's new will be marked with a red new tag. And so just to know that we will certainly vet all of these recommendations with the people who would be responsible, and so we won't be dumping work on anybody unexpectedly. Hopefully, Lydia, you agree.
Oh yeah, and you already know that, Lily. I mean, and at the end, well, I think it's not new for anybody of this that it's here that we are collecting also all the comments and the feedbacks and the recommendations throughout this task force process. Well, everybody knows that DEEP is also undertaking, it is in the early stages, but we are undertaking our policy process regarding hydrogen, that it's and it's part of the comprehensive energy strategy. We have onboarded recently consultants also from Engie Impact that are supporting this process. We are developing a white paper on hydrogen throughout this process that we expect to provide public comments opportunities on this white paper in early 2023. So all these engagement opportunities is extremely welcomed, and we will definitely provide more of them as we go forward with this policy process. We also expect to have a couple of more technical meetings around hydrogen next year, so there will be plenty of opportunities to have more engagement and to hear more recommendations.
Thank you, Lydia. That's helpful. So if we feel like we've made enough space for the recommendations here, I did want to shift over into some of the feedback that we received that will be captured in the stakeholder feedback portion. So we did receive some feedback in support and also potential concern about the recommendations. One area was that many brownfields are located in environmental justice communities and distressed municipalities where residents have already been burdened by some environmental harms from existing infrastructure and uses of land. So concern about potentially siting hydrogen infrastructure in these neighborhoods and on brownfields, and also concerned about the size constraints for hydrogen infrastructure on brownfields based on how big some of the brownfields are. One comment that was noted in some of my conversations with DECD, one was that if the program's running effectively, potentially enabling these programs could simply require marketing and education. So looking at, and that was contributed by our co-chair Carmen. So really looking at, not reinventing the wheel if things are going well so far. And then also just a quick note that brownfields are often in areas that are utility connected, so they could be well primed to serve some high priority end uses based on their location. Just want to make sure if there's any additional comments, any amendments to comments that I captured. Certainly don't want to misquote or misrepresent anybody's thoughts or feedback. And then if there's anything additional that you want to make sure that makes it into the report.
I have a question. So the feedback is sort of contradicting our recommendation, like Connecticut should avoid siting hydrogen infrastructure on these brownfields. So many times, our brownfields are located in urban, in cities, and they might intersect with these EJ communities. And when we take up a brownfield site, we are cleaning up to the standards that it needs to be cleaned up, either residential or industrial. So I'm not sure if it may better the EJ community rather than be be harmful. So just a comment from my perspective. So are we going to be including the feedback just like that, or are we going to give a little commentary on that as well?
Erin, you may be able to speak to exactly how this, stakeholder feedback will be refined, but the purpose of this is to ensure that we're capturing the array of different perspectives that participate, because we've been so lucky to have awesome participation in this forum. And so we will be definitely making space for a variety of opinions in our stakeholder feedback portion. But Erin, I'm not sure if you have any comments on sort of how these will be.
Yeah, I'll just chime in here. I mean, I think so. Something that I think was really important to us as we were going through this process is making sure that we could develop recommendations that, a lot of folks would feel comfortable rallying behind. We recognize that we've touched on a lot of topics where folks do have differences of opinion and where they are thinking about the opportunity and the challenges from different perspectives. And so we want to make sure that those, I mean, this is a perfect example, right? Where folks are saying, hey, the infrastructure is primed and ready, and there's, maybe lower investment requirements. And on the other hand, there could be some pretty significant community impact, and it's important to acknowledge and be aware of that. And so when we think about the stakeholder feedback and the structure that Lily laid out at the beginning of like finding recommendations and stakeholder feedback, the stakeholder feedback is a huge part of really providing a well-rounded picture about how different, organizations, entities in the state are approaching some of these opportunities. And so, there's a variety of things. I mean, one, we are providing a number of recommendations about how to increase community engagement in the process. And I think that's something that can really help to work through some of the concerns that have been raised. But on the other hand, wanting to make sure that the stakeholder feedback sections of the report kind of capture some of these complexities and nuances, so that as folks are moving forward with this, they think about how to address this and how the future stakeholder processes can incorporate some of these concerns. So I hope that, Banu, I don't know if that provides helpful context on how we're thinking about this.
Yeah, just wanted to make sure that's how it's going to be taken. Thanks.
Yeah. And just, I guess, while we're here, because that's a great question, definitely, one, welcome any input from the Green Bank team about how y'all are thinking about this, or two, any other stakeholder questions about how we're sort of navigating some of these differences of opinion that have come in through the feedback process.
I just thinking out loud here, Aaron, and not having thought about what happens after January 15th, but trying to, as the legislature receives the material, the report, and you have the findings, the recommendations, and the stakeholder feedback, how they think about that stakeholder feedback in terms of then the debate that they would then engage in a public forum to think about the public policy conversation, right? So that's like in this context, if I were a legislator and I wanted to think about more funding for DECD for brownfields to support hydrogen in this context, maybe perhaps to allay the concern here is what we were talking about before, requiring programmatically the inclusion of a community benefit agreement so that the community has the voice in terms of addressing this, right? So I think by having this in the report, and then ultimately whatever that forum is for that conversation for whatever policy, if the legislature wants to do something, then what we're doing is we're providing them all feedback from the participants in the process to help them think about what is a good solution. I don't think we're going to answer it, right? That's what I guess what I'm saying is I think we're just presenting it as a perspective.
That's right, Brian. I think it's making sure that this gets carried forward as folks continue the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Any additional stakeholder feedback that we should be sure to capture? And, if folks feel more comfortable providing them to me over email, happy to receive that, ideally by Friday, because I would love to incorporate them in the next cut of the report. Otherwise, we will move forward on to our next legislative mandate. So our next mandate was an examination on how to position the state to take advantage of the competitive incentives and programs created by the IIJA. So just as a reminder of what we covered over the time looking at this area. So we looked at specifically a bunch of the different areas of potential funding opportunity for hydrogen within the IIJA. And one of the deliverables that you will see provided in the report is just that list. We're including a comprehensive appendix of all of the different areas of potential funding for hydrogen, and it's a pretty comprehensive spreadsheet that includes all of the funding amounts, the match requirements, everything like that. So I'm actually happy to send that to this group after this call to let me know if I've missed anything. Certainly welcome your feedback there. Two of the areas that we determined were really important to look into more deeply, especially as we're looking at competitiveness for federal funding, is ensuring that we are appropriately meeting the requirements of Justice 40. So many of the programs within the IIJA are covered by the Justice 40 executive order, which looks at 40% of the overall investments and benefits flowing to disadvantaged communities. We also know that it'll be important to ensure that we can meet the match requirements for a variety of different funding opportunities, the competitive ones, which include requirement for non-federal match funding. So this is a super high level, just some notes on some of the things that we talked about over the past couple of months. So many recommendations here. We'll chat through them all, but this was definitely an area where there was a lot of activity, I would say, both within the funding working group and then also within other working groups and looking at some priority end uses. One of the first areas is that, DEEP should lead the interagency and interstate coordination on hydrogen policy development and funding. We had a lot of things that came up through, I know, our working group and others about just ensuring that we're all working in tandem. Different teams are not creating ideas, policies, definitions for hydrogen, anything like that that could be potentially conflicting because that could just set everything back. So really with Deep at the helm of some of Connecticut's work on hydrogen to date, they would be a great leader to continue to move that forward with the different state agencies. And we recommend that they do take the lead on coordinating to ensure alignment within the state's efforts. The next area that we've discussed in this working group quite a bit is that the legislature could create a transparent source for municipalities, cities, and other applicants to access resources such as match funding and other application guidance. Something that continuously came up is that this is challenging for people to apply to. There's difficulty knowing what's out there, knowing the requirements, accessing potential different sources of match funding. People don't know where the resources are located. So we could create a central place to understand all of these opportunities and items and resources. We saw a cool example of this in Colorado, which is called out in the report. So just wanted to raise that. There was also the potential of considering appropriating grant funding specifically towards the federal match requirement. And as came out of the end use working group, we could allocate specific funding towards some of the best end or the highest end uses that were identified. And fueling stations were also called out to support a variety of different multi-sectoral off-takers. We saw examples of this in California and Colorado. So that's that third line. I can keep moving down the line, but if people have comments throughout, happy to pause anywhere.
Lily, the third bullet is just a more specific bullet of the second one, right? Second one is broad match funding. The third is saying, let's also create a pool specifically for end uses that are important that have been identified. Is that the distinction between the?
Yeah, that's the distinction, but I see a lot of overlap and I'm wondering if we need both.
Yeah, that's where I was. But having observed the end use the uses working group, they are trying to get more specific in terms of the higher priority areas. So I can see a use for the third, but maybe there's a way of bringing that into the second.
Yeah, I think. Oh, go ahead, Erin.
I would just chime in. I think something that's stands out for me as distinct between 2 and 3 is 2 also has some pieces about information and just information availability. As we've been combing through all of the documents and all of the resources, we can tell you it's a time-intensive and labor-intensive process, and not everyone who might be interested in applying might be able to do that. And so, like making those resources publicly available to folks, I think is valuable, even if there is no funding allocation along with that. So we can think about needing to kind of tighten the language if that's helpful. Okay, I see a thumb.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
So those top 3, I would say, are really focused on specifically that match funding piece, or I guess the second 2 actually are more focused on that match funding piece. Then we get into some of the Justice 40 pieces and really making sure that the benefits are realized by communities for some of these projects, and that communities have the ability to engage on some of the pieces that were discussed. So one recommendation is to specifically provide funding that can increase community engagement and decrease the burden of engagement on communities. So some of the examples that came up in our conversations was around funding for time and resources. So if communities want to get technical experts or consulting services to develop these community benefits agreements, because while it's awesome that the IRA and IIJA includes community benefits agreements, they could require considerable time and resources from local stakeholders. So want to make sure that we're supporting that. And then relatedly, DEEP and PURA should consider implementing an intervenor compensation program. So that's just a more specific recommendation within that area to increase community participation in hydrogen-related proceedings as the policy landscape unfolds. A bunch of different states have implemented programs that we could look at. There's Minnesota, California, Idaho, Oregon, and Wisconsin. So certainly it's something we could look at as a potential way to increase engagement on the policy side. Any pause there to see if anyone has thoughts. And then the last recommendation that's marked with the red new. So we heard a lot of feedback that, you know, Connecticut has a competitive advantage as it comes to electrolyzers and fuel cell industry. And so just it might be a good idea to specifically call out that we are recommending that eligible entities should pursue these specific areas. And I think that could also open the conversation for those entities to identify what's needed for them to be successful and thrive in these applications.
So this one became very clear, I feel like, at our Tuesday task force meeting of the economic development industry that Connecticut has such a strong basis behind. It feels like this one to me would go up behind the match stuff where the state, I think you would want the state to try to support academia and industry state match so that we're building out, you know, we're supporting the economic development of the industry that we have. Otherwise, this just feels to me like it's saying to the eligible entities, go ahead and apply for funding. Well, okay, that's what they're gonna kind of do anyways. But what can the state do to help them? It can be a source of match funds to make them more competitive to winning those reasons.
So, Brian, I guess just a question for you about what this would look like in process, because I know we have a bunch of items that we've identified here that are a little bit like, hey, we know work needs to be done in this area. Someone needs to go think about these things. And I think this is something where, hey, it would be great if you know, some of these organizations could go think about what they would want to take on in terms of pursuing manufacturing funding, and then also what that would mean in terms of what they'd be looking for from the state to support them. And that's kind of incremental work above and beyond what we've been able to do so far. But just wondering, like, what would that process look like for these entities to get specific with, you know, the legislature or the government about the support that was needed?
I don't know. So I'm looking at the third bullet. The legislature should consider appropriating grant funding to support federal match, you know, and then what you're doing here is you're giving a bullet to the end uses, but you also want to give a bullet to the industry and academia that are pursuing based on the economic development of the industry. So in this context, the recommendation is legislature funding. Okay, so then the debate, I think, at the legislature is, do we have resources to be able to support this given all the needs of government? What's the level of funding we can provide? Okay, we're providing it, and for what? And I think that would be defined by some process. I think what we're saying here is preference should go towards end uses that are important, and in this case, industry representatives who are driving the economic development of the industry. So I don't know. I don't know, Barbara, if you had a thought here.
Well, I mean, the recommendations, the way we fund is through departments. And so unless the legislature decides to develop a whole new on their own program like they did with CIF. So it would mean that a department or an academic institution takes up this recommendation and actually puts it in their requests for funding. But that will be up to the departments. You know, they know what their needs are and what their requirements are. the legislature, as you know, Brian, very rarely sets aside kind of pots of dollars that don't have owners to it. So it's for us, it's always the owner who raises their hand and asks the legislature to fund a specific thing. That's the process. The good thing is that this will come out in January as the process is gearing up, and all of the agencies are putting together their requests. So it's great timing.
Yeah, I'm sorry that I maybe confused people with skipping ahead, but I did want to call out, I also put it framed a little differently in the sort of other sources of funding, which there's a lot of overlap between the IIJA and the DECD, but maybe this speaks to kind of what you were talking about, Barbara, about, you know, who would be asking for this within an existing program. So I wanted to flag that this is not yet discussed with DECD. I talked to Carmen, who's helping with some of my co-chair activities, and she wanted to raise it with the manufacturing team there, but it's like kind of being a bit more specific that they should identify potential opportunities because for this industry, given. Do you have thoughts on if that kind of captures?
I would recommend, and Venu may be able to help in this area. In the new, it says not yet discussed with DCD. It's DCD and OPM, because OPM owns the revenue side of the tax incentives. So when the state considers new tax incentives, obviously DCD is part of the conversation, but in a much more important part of the conversation is OPM, because they track these tax incentives and they measure the impact of those incentives on our revenues, our tax. Venu, I don't know if you want to add anything. I just suggest that it's not only DCD, it's got to include OPM.
Yeah, I agree with you, Barbara. I think after discussion with Carmen, we can fine tune that.
Definitely, and definitely don't mean to bring anything upon anyone. It just came up in our working group yesterday and wanted to make sure it was captured because it felt like a really consistent theme.
And it feels like, Lily, the three things that you just showed us are effectively this other new one at the tail end here. Right?
Yeah, the red one about DECD should consider the different. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, and maybe that's the better way of framing the recommendation is, you know, we should take a serious look at how we can support this industry. Like the recommendation. So I can rehome the recommendation. It was sort of living under, and ultimately it doesn't matter. They're all within the report, but it had just been living on that sort of other funding category. So I think
this slide's pegging to the IIJA because it's one of the 7. Okay, no, that's fine.
But,
maybe we just asterisk it and say also reflected in the other funding too, or something like that.
Yes. No, I mean, it can be fluid. So but I think I've captured, so OPM needs to be involved. We'll definitely fine tune with DECD and Carmen and Benu in terms of how we could frame what might be supportive for manufacturing and looking at how to make them super competitive. Any other thoughts? And Barbara, I'm sorry, I know I was doing a lot of slides. Like I wanted to make sure I showed that other recommendation that was relevant, but did I capture some of what you commented? I just want to make sure we got everything. Okay. Awesome. Any thoughts that we did not get to? And then we'll go into stakeholder feedback. I see one hand. Oh yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Thanks. I think one thing that strikes me in these recommendations is there could be, I think, because we are talking about priorities and what in the report, what's the highest end use that these particular recommendations feel like wide open versus making sure that these recommendations also have the guidelines of to do this for the most suitable end use or sources.
So making things like the third one, because I see we called out specific end uses. Is there a different one that you'd want to add more specificity to? Just looking at.
Yeah, I don't know that I have specific editing guidance at the moment, but just thinking about what thinking about the legislature and action they might take to create transparent sources or grant funding based on this slide, if they don't kind of have the broader picture of, here's where the report is recommending you put your efforts into.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a really good call out. I think under those sections, we'll definitely reference some examples from other states and what they're doing with the funding and maybe what we've heard from stakeholders as really valuable resources that would be valuable for them. But certainly if, as you're reviewing the report, if things feel like they're missing, we would, I'd love that call out. It's a really good recommendation as well. Let's see. In the stakeholder feedback portion, oops, it looks like something got cut off, but we got a ton of stakeholder feedback on different IIJA activities. Actually, I guess sort of split between the two funding areas, but a couple of general feedback points. Generally, a lot of support for increased transparency. What are the federal funding opportunities and how to make it more publicly accessible? I think I'd like to actually follow up with the Nature Conservancy to understand if it's the searchable database of opportunities or if it's a searchable database of what projects are actually being built or being developed. So that is a point of clarification. It sounds like more on the development side and just making sure that it's enabling better community engagement on those granted funding areas. And then we also received sort of a +1 support to the idea of making sure that there's interagency consistency and integration. So that was a helpful point of feedback. And then from working group feedback that I heard from all of you, while we were able to capture some of the scale of the state level programs and the federal programs, not everything is super available in terms of exactly how much maybe an applicant or an awardee can expect from any of these programs, because there was a lot of desire to sort of understand the funding stack and say, if I need X amount in match funding in order to qualify, but this program only has X amount, there was a lot of sort of mental math going on, and not a lot of that information was super readily accessible. We tried to include as much of it in the spreadsheet and the funding resources as possible, but potentially just calling out maybe a need for more transparency around how much funding different awards could entail, even if that's a range. Any additional feedback? And then Sam, I've captured your great point about getting a little bit more specific as well about how we might like to see some of these recommendations coming to life. And then I also saw a really awesome recommendation in the chat from Andrea about coordinating and assisting stakeholders. So I will definitely take a look into that resource and include that.
Oh yeah, I imagine you may have looked into that already. You were talking about how do you make opportunities more transparent to stakeholders without, combing through all that many hours that you guys have. And so you probably already know about California Go Biz.
Yeah.
But I just thought I'd include the link just anyway.
Yeah, no, this is great. I specifically, we were looking at, they did do a pretty substantial state funding allocation towards match funding. So that's, I think, what we were specifically referring to. So I'll make sure that I've evaluated that resource too, and that it's in there as another example. So thank you. This is great. Great. If no other comments, we will continue tracking forward. So our third legislative mandated topic is around looking at recommendations regarding funding sources for hydrogen fueled energy programs and infrastructure. So it was pretty open-ended. It's like, what else can we do? How else, where could funding be supportive, and what's out there? So we specifically delved into the IRA and other federal funding opportunities to see, what are we missing? We can't just focus on IIJA. There was also this really exciting other act passed, so worth looking into. So one of the deliverables, as I mentioned, will be this really comprehensive table, essentially, in the appendix of the report. We also took some notes from the end uses working group and some of the other working groups to hear what their groups felt like were really priority areas to focus on based on their research and stakeholder feedback. And because they were also looking at cost competitiveness, so where funding could really be supportive to put an end use that might be high impact and not have other opportunities to decarbonize into that cost competitive realm. So some of the different recommendations that emerged from this more open-ended mandate on looking at other funding areas. So specifically, some of these focus on the priority end uses where there's not necessarily other great options to decarbonize or cost-effective options. So one area is for Deep and Pura to consider promoting the use of hydrogen end uses that are currently commercially viable through existing clean energy programs. So looking at what's already out there that could be modified or has a gap that doesn't specifically enable hydrogen. So that's calling out the preference to work within existing structures. I know, Barbara, you were calling out that that's sometimes the easiest way to ensure that there is opportunity for hydrogen. So that was sort of a top level recommendation that came. I think that one came from the policy working group. So if Aaron or Jennifer, you have any color to add there, feel free. The next area is to consider tax exemptions for hydrogen vehicles and critical facilities that produce or use clean hydrogen. The hydrogen vehicles portion, this one also came from the policy working group. There in 2023, I'm sure all of you are aware that the Connecticut enacted Clean Air Act and the Clean Vehicle mandates, which authorizes the DEEP commissioner to adopt regulations implementing California's medium and heavy duty motor vehicle standards. So the policy working group felt that this would be very complementary to that. So just wanted to provide a little bit of background since I know that conversation wasn't specifically being had in our working group. And then at the third recommendation, calling out that DEEP should identify and potentially expand clean transportation incentives to include some of the other mobility applications that are difficult to decarbonize. So looking at on-site port handling equipment, hovercraft, and ocean-going vessels in collaboration with other state and federal agencies. So the call out here, I believe, was from the end uses working group that launching similar funding opportunities can help to send strong market signals about decarbonizing these hard to abate sectors. And so happy to answer any questions on those three. If none, we'll keep moving. Thank you, Barbara. I appreciate your participation. I know we brought up, thanks so much. Have a wonderful holiday if we don't talk before then. We discussed earlier this consideration to amend the requirements for the community benefits agreements through Public Act 21-43 to lower the minimum project size from 2 megawatts to 1 megawatt. The reason why I had living in this category is because the 1 megawatt, and I think we need to call this out in the report, the 1 megawatt threshold for community benefits agreements is in the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. So that would make Connecticut's policies more consistent with the policies at the federal level. There's also a component of that's been called out in the report, which is the Public Act is only covered right now covers fuel cells for power generation. So that's the application that it would cover for hydrogen, which isn't necessarily fully comprehensive of the projects that we're talking about. So we could recommend expansion of the statute to include hydrogen projects in a more general sense. Oh, Brian, I see your hand up. Thank you. I know you're super familiar with this program, so sorry if I was floundering it.
No. It's one. The policy has to deal with class 1. So I'll chat through. I think this should say 2 megawatts to 1 megawatt, i.e., class 1 fuel cells. So that's clear. But Pura does a really good job of articulating that what we're saying here really is that hydrogen should be included in this, not just class 1. Hydrogen's not a class 1. Fuel cells are a class 1. So I'll try to, in the chat, give the tail end of this so it's clearer. But in Pura's comments, they did a great job of articulating it. What I could not clearly articulate, they did a great job of doing that.
Yes, thank you. And we have all of those as well. So we'll definitely be implementing all of those public comments, especially from Pura. I think this recommendation will be really fully fleshed out in the policy working group as well. But as it is relevant to the funding working group and specifically accessing federal funding, wanted to make sure that it's consistent, and we chat about it here. The final three are newer ones that I just wanted to make sure that we had the chance to discuss. Starting at the top, we heard a lot about UConn being a huge asset for this state and having a real champion in their president, which can play a key role in leading the fuel cell and electrolyzer industry in the state. So wanted to make sure that we call that out and welcome them to identify opportunities where they would like to contribute towards the hydrogen workforce and technology innovation. So curious if folks have feedback on that specifically. That really came out of some of our working groups and the task force meeting.
Yeah, I feel like on Tuesday, we spoke to Connecticut having probably the only university president in the country who's a fuel cell hydrogen expert. So we should definitely find a place for President Merrick in these recommendations. Workforce, innovation, what universities do.
Absolutely. And this is sort of to that good point, this is a sort of shared recommendation with the workforce working group. Alrighty, and then I know we discussed this point about the DECD and the fuel cell and electrolyzer industry manufacturing. We will follow up offline with DECD, and then let's see who else was identified as somebody who we should certainly talk to. I have it in my notes, but it sounds like that one needs to be fleshed out a little bit more.
OPM.
OPM, yes, thank you. So we will certainly be looking into how to frame this best, and then also potentially combining it with the other recommendation that was quite similar, or got at a similar thing. I see a hand. Go ahead, Samantha.
Yeah, I think one, it would be helpful to understand what you're suggesting here. The fuel cell industry, as Brian just said, is a class 1 renewable, so they're already being subsidized through the ratepayers as a class 1 renewable resource, which Sierra Club finds problematic as long as they continue to use gas as a feedstock or gas to run the fuel cells. But let's recognize they already have a massive injection of funding through the ratepayers. And there's other programs, including a 30 megawatt procurement of fuel cells, which has resulted in $500 million of investment in the fuel cell industry. So I think we need to be more clear about what's being discussed here, and also to recognize that there is some significant environmental community concerns about incentivizing fuel cells run on fossil fuel feedstocks. And so future tax incentives or programs should be for green fuel cells run on wind, solar, non-fossil fuel feedstocks would be our perspective.
Yeah, I thank you for those. Oh,
Samantha, are you talking about the 2143 or just broadly like class 1?
Broadly class 1.
Okay.
I was thinking, oh, sorry, go ahead, Brian.
No, I'm just trying to think of how we reflect that as a stakeholder comment. Like, I feel like the debate of the legislature on class 1 fuel cells, natural gas, whatever the legislature made a decision on industrial policy, whatever that decision was, but we should reflect the stakeholder feedback on the fuel cell component that Samantha's speaking to.
Certainly. I was thinking those were kind of two different threads, because the idea of additional funding into the fuel cell industry, the way that we were thinking about it wasn't necessarily as, to add additional funding for the deployment of those fuel cells in Connecticut, although we do talk about critical facilities and things like that. The point about the DECD to identify the tax incentives was more about Connecticut leading on this global industry, because regardless of how the hydrogen landscape plays out in the state, there's going to be significant demand, domestically and federally for fuel cells, and how could Connecticut, get jobs from that opportunity and ensure that they're really positioned as the leading state for that resource and commodity. So I'm curious, is that wasn't quite how it came across, it sounds like?
It's not how it came across. And also, I think like we have an opportunity to lead on, fuel cells run on green hydrogen, and whether like we want to be more clear about what that means.
Yeah, so
Because if we want the world to be running on the cleanest hydrogen, I think we shouldn't be subsidizing dirty hydrogen.
I think
fuel cells.
Samantha, like in I don't know how we're addressing this in the funding. I'm just thinking about the definitional debate that's happening in the policy group, right, around this, that kind of framing. Yeah. Like in this context, it does feel that this is more economic development. Like, for example, the other day at High Axiom, one of the points they raised was they manufacture 60 megawatts of fuel cells a year, and 90% of those are exported to South Korea. So it's about economic development in that context, which is what I think these are primarily about. But maybe I'm missing it.
But I hear where you're coming from, and not to put words in your mouth at all, Sam, but I was just hearing, if we are supporting a fuel cell industry, let's make sure it's for hydrogen specifically, if we can, and let's potentially make sure that we do what we can to ensure that it's being used for clean hydrogen. Is that? So we don't want to subsidize maybe fuel cells that run on, the manufacturing of fuel cells that are running on natural gas is kind of what I heard.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, it totally can be captured, and this is definitely the hydrogen task force. So we will certainly make sure that, recommendations are pretty specified for hydrogen where we can. So thank you. It's helpful feedback, and really appreciate the push for being more specific, because that's, it's always really helpful. Okay, well, this time flew. We did not end early, as I said we may. Apologies, but that was amazing feedback from everybody. I do have some points of stakeholder feedback on these areas. A lot of great feedback came from the fuel cell industry and from different commercial entities in the state that around what could be useful for them. So happy to send this out to where it can be helpful. In terms of the opportunities for further engagement, Lydia, I know you mentioned earlier sort of what's to come, what DEEP is working on. Is there anything we didn't get to? I want to make sure you have time.
No, I don't think so, Lily. I think the important piece of that was already said, and there's the other working group in 3 minutes. So yeah, let's just, for the sake of time.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you, and exciting to hear that there's going to be a white paper and other great work to come. So just the reminder of the timeline. So we'll be distributing the final report, draft final report to the task force on Friday. And then we don't have much time in these 2 minutes, but I just wanted to call out that, not all of the recommendations were discussed in this working group. I highlighted in yellow some of them that we did talk about, but you'll see a lot of the specific recommendations around production, end use, and some of the ecosystem engagement pieces are going to be discussed in other working groups. There is a policy working group right after this call. I also wanted to call out that, all of these will be summarized in their final report, and they won't be so segmented by like working group. They'll be more segmented, at least in the executive summary, in terms of who is expected to carry this forward as a way for it to be a potentially very actionable document. So I will send out this deck so that you can noodle on it and give me any further feedback, and also to take a deeper look at if you want to check out any of the other recommendations from other working groups. I welcome you to do so, and if you don't know who's running them or what working group it pertains to, I'm happy to sort of route your feedback in the right direction, since at this point we're all very much working together to deliver this final report. Any other thoughts or feedback before we hop off?
No, thanks so much.
Thank you, and thank you for your excellent feedback. And thank you for coming to our working group. I feel like we have a very amazing, consistent crew in this funding working group. I know Sam and Lydia and folks have been showing up really consistently. So thank you so much for your feedback. It's made a huge difference as we're working and starting to create this report. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lily. Bye bye.
Bye. See you all soon. Happy holidays.